You're listening to episode 31 of the Physical Education Podcast. Today, returning guest Jay Feldman joins me to discuss the topic of hormesis, and which helps us shed light on why interventions like ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting, and veganism might actually be counterproductive and working against your best interests. Hi, I'm Pierre Morand, and you're about to learn about the hidden and often misunderstood causes of chronic pain. For 15 years, I suffered with chronic pain with no cause or end in sight. I tried everything I could find, but was often left with unanswered questions and conflicting advice. So I decided to take matters into my own hands and to become a physical therapist. I studied everything I could about pain, about the body, and about health. Along the way, I realized that the solutions to my pain and health issues were within me. I didn't need someone to fix me. I needed to reclaim ownership of my body and fix myself. More importantly, I needed to fix myself while honoring and understanding my body's own wisdom and capacity for self-healing. Since then, I've worked on bringing this knowledge to others in pain, combining pain science, psychology, biomechanics, nutrition, and neurology to provide the light bulb moments and self-awareness to take control. Because eventually most people in pain realize they need to understand the bigger picture of what causes chronic pain. The purpose of this podcast is to help you see and navigate that bigger picture so that you can finally reclaim control of your health and overcome pain once and for all. Hi folks, we've got Jay Feldman on today, back for his second episode to discuss all things hormesis. Jay, how are you?
I'm good, PA. How are you doing?
Great. I suppose we'll get straight into it. We had your intro, sort of your background, how you came to do what you do in the last episode. So I would encourage people to listen to that first. But today we're going to talk about the topic of hormesis, which is it's a very important concept that underpins so many health recommendations and ideologies, and so many things are sort of contingent on hormesis being true or hormesis being what people claim it is. And you wrote a series of 2 articles that really picked apart the whole theory of hormesis, the flaws with the research, and how it applies to a lot of common health recommendations. So to kind of get us started, maybe you could define the term hormesis for the purpose of this podcast.
Sure, yeah. So hormesis is something that's not talked about as much in the mainstream, but people who are looking more in depth at the research and the science are talking more about it. And yeah, it's definitely a pretty, kind of a fundamental feature of a lot of different health paradigms. But so to define it, I would just say it's basically the idea that a small amount of stress caused by something in our environment, which could include something we eat or anything else that we're doing. A small amount of stress causes a defensive reaction in our body that ends up being beneficial for our health. And there's all sorts of applications from there, but that's kind of the simplest definition.
Okay. And would you be happy going straight into the likes of where you see the flaws? So basically, how did it get to this point where people believe that hormesis is beneficial? Do you feel like it's just a misunderstanding of the research?
Maybe, but I think, it's got a kind of a long history, and even that definition isn't, has kind of morphed over time. And even saying, a small amount of stress that causes benefits is kind of arbitrary, because what some researchers are calling a small amount of stress, I definitely wouldn't say is a small amount. So that's all relative. But the idea being that stress or damage causes benefits, this idea started maybe about 70 years ago, or at least really kind of started gaining momentum at that point.
Yeah.
Where the idea was that small amount of damage caused by a really kind of toxic agent would cause some amount of benefit. So they were looking at very small amounts of cadmium or arsenic or methylmercury, like very, very things that we know to be very toxic, and like irradiation as well. And so they're looking at these things, and some researchers found, or think that they found, that small amounts of these things caused improvements in health and reductions in cancer and things like that, which was the opposite effect as what they knew happened at a larger dose. And that's kind of where it started. That was kind of what some of the research found, and maybe we'll talk about that research and why it didn't end up being all that valid. But from there, it expanded and became a defense from industries against people who are concerned about pollution or radiation exposure, and basically saying, well, hey, small amounts of these things aren't so bad. They maybe are even beneficial. And so it kind of started from that point, which is a relatively dangerous, I would say, perspective to have when we're talking about, these industries potentially polluting or, polluting the environment and affecting our health with radiation or different heavy metals or whatever it is. And it kind of progressed from there, and more recently became more associated with kind of regular everyday stresses that we experience. So caloric restriction is one of the interventions that's studied a lot in the research as far as something that's supposed to have health benefits. And I'm sure we'll talk about that too, and why it's not as beneficial, or what might be accounting for those benefits, because it's not simply restricting calories. Yeah. And so that kind of ended up falling under this idea of hormesis, where the caloric restriction, for example, was causing stress, and that then led to, and then we know the outcome was increased lifespan or something like that. So that's kind of how it ended up morphing into something that now is kind of the thing that a lot of different interventions are attributed to. So caloric restriction is one, but also ketogenic diets and cold thermogenesis and different supplements like resveratrol, or I don't know, there's several others. So a lot of those things have now been lumped into this hormesis category, this idea that these things cause small amounts of stress, and then that stress results in some sort of benefit. And even more recently, it's actually been, they're starting to attribute really kind of mundane, I don't know, like regular everyday things that we know are beneficial, like certain vitamins and minerals and water and just basic needs. They attribute these also to hormesis, basically suggesting that these things cause stress, and that's why they're beneficial, and not for some other reason, like that they fulfill some need or requirement that we have for a certain nutrient.
Okay. And so just going back to, you mentioned how this sort of idea was initially discovered, say, roughly 70 years ago. Do you think that it was just a misinterpretation, and then it was capitalized upon by industries that could spin it as actually these substances aren't that bad and they may be beneficial? Or do you feel like there was foul play from the beginning? Could you explain how the research was misinterpreted?
Yeah, so I would like to think the former. I don't know. I don't know the specific intent of the original researchers coming across this, and so if their intent was, hey, we need to find a reason why these pollutants aren't so bad, we need, then maybe there was foul play from the start.
Sure.
If so, I'm not aware of it, but I do know that the research, those initial researchers are very much in favor of, or are very much defending the pollution and radiation exposure and things like that. So it wouldn't surprise me if there was something like that going on. So I'm not sure if it was kind of an organic finding or if it was subsidized by some of these industries, but I don't know. I don't know how. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have the best answer there, but
sure,
either one is perfectly possible.
Yeah, and so then researchers nowadays that would be using information on hormesis to explain health benefits. Do you feel like they simply don't understand the history of it? That they haven't looked deep enough, or that they're perhaps ignoring the unfavorable information and only focusing on what appears favorable?
Yeah, I don't know specifically, what anyone might think, but as far as my conjecture, I mean,
sure.
It's the history alone isn't a reason to discount the idea, right? So it definitely has a history that I would say is nefarious, although a lot of people would say it isn't, that it had nothing to do with the industry funding, and it had more to do with, some organic finding that was scientifically valid, and then it just had these certain applications. But I mean, the history alone doesn't invalidate it, but it's definitely a cause for skepticism for sure. And I think that most researchers now are probably aware of that, but I think it's more that it's the current researchers are more of morphing the idea to fit their current paradigm, and they do go hand in hand. So I do think a lot of researchers now don't realize that by kind of morphing hormesis into an idea that sounds more valid, they're also supporting those sort of potentially dangerous underpinnings. I don't know if that's necessarily the thought process there. I would expect it's not.
Sure. Yeah, I often wonder in terms of because a lot of these things like intermittent fasting, keto, all that kind of stuff tends to be kind of, or appears to be spearheaded by an Instagram guru, some sort of figure in the world of health. And I wonder if they try things and feel some sort of short-term benefit, and then they look for the evidence that supports it, rather than they just look at a pool of evidence and then come up with a health strategy. It seems like it's more reverse engineered, or trying to fit the data to your lived experience, which would be a flawed way of doing things. So that's what I suspect happens a lot of the time, because people have all sorts of their own stuff, we'll say, and all sorts of their own insecurities, and they're just looking for, maybe a slimmer body, and then they fit the data to support their experience. So maybe we could take something like a ketogenic diet and pick apart the claims. Maybe I'll be the keto person in this. I'll play devil's advocate, and we could pick apart the flaws with that. So let's see. The major claims, what would be the major claims of a ketogenic diet? That you're restricting carbohydrates and what would you say are the major claims?
Well, it's funny, because when I was in that place where I was doing things like ketogenic diets, I definitely fell into that latter category you were talking about, where it was kind of diet first and then all the information second. So it's just funny that happens, because when I was in that place, I was able to parrot all the things that it was supposed to do, because it's supposed to, improve insulin sensitivity, because carbohydrates are the cause of diabetes and therefore cause insulin resistance. And so, lacking a reduction in carbs is supposed to improve insulin sensitivity. And because of that, it's supposed to improve body composition, lead to fat loss, because that's, again, only a product of insulin, which is, I would say, like a minor side point, or even an important thing. I just don't think that insulin causes fat gain. I think that's pretty clear in the research.
Yeah.
But so there's claims like that keto diets improve insulin sensitivity because carbs increase insulin resistance. There's claims that things like that any amount of glucose in our system leads to damage to DNA and lipid peroxidation and things, because glucose can create ages, which is just like an oxidized sugar with a protein, and there's a lot of details there, but so things like that, that improves mitochondrial respiration, because we're supposed to be fueled by fat, because when we starve, fat is our primary fuel. So that supposedly means that that's the ideal fuel for our health when we're not starving. I think those are some of the main claims that come to mind.
Sure. And so in terms of hormesis, because when we burn fat, or in order to burn fat, when we've run out of glycogen, out of sugar, there is a release of stress hormones. And is that where hormesis would be used to defend ketosis, as in actually stress hormones aren't bad because hormesis is good? Would that be fair to say? Would that be a likely claim?
Yeah, very much on the surface, but I don't think most people who are saying it actually realize that that's what they're saying. They're typically looking at a deeper level, on the cellular level, where they're looking at reactive oxygen species production and increases in autophagy and things like that, which we can, if we don't want to dig into at the second, that's fine. But I think those are more of, they're looking at that in-depth part and seeing those as beneficial without an understanding of the greater context of things like increases in stress hormones that would come with those in this case. And so that's more of where it comes from. So those things I listed off, the autophagy and mitochondrial biogenesis. Those are adaptations to stress. They're also adaptations that happen when we aren't stressed, but those are things that do happen when we're stressed because they basically improve our defenses against stress. And so those are things that are cited as hormetic, or as why ketogenic diets are hormetics. And so the reason why that is again, does come back to things like stress hormones and energy production.
Yeah.
As far as the hormesis goes, they are looking at fat oxidation, and increases in fatty acids are associated with things like autophagy. That's a huge one. Is people encouraging fasting because it increases autophagy. And same thing with mitochondrial biogenesis, or uncoupling is another one, where all those things are associated with fat oxidation, which is associated with ketogenic diets. But they aren't actually beneficial like they're said to be, at least not in that context. It's all contextual, and those things are adaptive, and because of that they have benefits, but that only goes so far.
Yeah. And so could you expand on the influence of context then? At what point does it become beneficial, and at what point is it actually counterproductive?
Yeah. So the distinction of whether it's beneficial or not beneficial is actually determined before the adaptation happens, if that makes sense. So if we're looking at this on the cellular level, when we have something like ketosis going on, it increases reactive oxygen species production, and that leads to uncoupling and autophagy and mitochondrial biogenesis as just a few of the adaptive effects. And the reason why, or in that state, this is going on in the context of a low energy state. And the reason for that is because there's different ways that we can produce, that reactive oxygen species can become produced in the mitochondria. And so when it's a result of fat oxidation, it has to do with changes in the electron transport chain. Essentially, there's specific things. So a change in the NAD to NADH ratio and FADH2 to NADH ratio, those sorts of things lead to reactive oxygen species production in the mitochondria. And that's what's going on in a low energy state. So in that state, we have low energy production, and energy production gets blocked, and that causes reactive oxygen species production, and then leads to all these adaptive effects. And on the other hand, the other scenario where we have these same effects going on is in a high energy state, because when we have a lot of energy, it essentially kind of blocks up the chain and stops energy production from happening or slows it down. And that's, again, it's an adaptive thing, because if we have a lot of energy, in our cells, we don't need to keep producing more. It's essentially wasteful and can potentially be damaging. So when this happens, it slows down energy production. And one of the ways it does that is by producing reactive oxygen species. And so this is a way of us putting the brakes on energy production, and also leads to things like autophagy and mitochondrial biogenesis. But in this case, it's because we have all this excess energy, and it's kind of like it's like a rebuilding and repairing process. Whereas in the other case, in the ketogenic state, it's more of a defensive reaction to better deal with stress. And so the main differences there are, one is the high energy state and one is the low energy state. And that also influences the health of the cell. So in the high energy state, we're protected against any sort of damage, or considerably protected against damage from reactive oxygen species because of the high ATP and the high carbon dioxide. Whereas in the low energy state, we're not protected from those things. So that can lead to lipid damage and DNA damage and protein damage.
Yeah.
So we have, in one state, it's the same kind of effect, but in one case, it's a defensive reaction to better deal with stress. In the other case, it's an effect of excess energy, not in a bad way, but in a good way, which allows us to repair and rebuild.
Okay. And how would you define a high energy state? Is it dependent on certain macronutrients, or is it dependent purely on calories? Or for sort of the lay person, what do you need to eat, so to speak, or how much do you need to eat to be in a high energy state?
Yeah, well, we definitely, there are certain requirements. So we need to be eating enough, for sure. And we need to make sure we're having enough carbohydrates because of the differences between the way that we use fats and carbs as a fuel. Basically, fats lead to a slowing of energy production. They lead to this reactive oxygen species production, and that ends up causing problems and not leading to a high energy state. So we need enough calories and we need enough carbs, but it's not that simple either, because there are other things that can prevent us from producing energy from the foods that we're eating. And that can be something like PUFA, or polyunsaturated fats, or it can be all sorts of different toxins that we can produce in our gut, like endotoxin or ammonia, or it can be heavy metals that we're exposed to, like mercury or arsenic, or it can be, ionizing radiation that can also inhibit that. So there's all sorts of other factors we have to consider that would potentially prevent us from getting to that high energy state.
Yeah. Okay. So if someone were, say, very low carb, but they avoided polyunsaturated fats, they avoided endotoxin, they avoided heavy metal poisoning,
Mm-hmm.
they wouldn't be in as bad of a position. So these are, I suppose this gets down to the nuance of everything. It's not keto versus carbs, it's the individual who maybe happens to do keto and other things, but we're kind of focused on the keto part or the carb part. So it is far more nuanced than carbs or no carbs. But yeah, so a person who maybe avoids carbs but does everything else right isn't maybe necessarily going to see the downsides of avoiding carbs as quickly. Would that be fair to say?
I would say that they would probably feel better in the short term,
Yeah.
but I would wonder whether they would get to that long term faster, because when we're in again, it's all so individual and contextual.
Yeah.
But when we're in kind of a low energy state, a depressed state, like our thyroid function is depressed, our metabolism is lower, we can do okay in that state for a long time. It's kind of like a hibernating state. And so someone might be able to live longer and actually feel better on that versus, maybe let's say a low carb diet where they don't have any. So in that first one, they would have, let's say PUFA would be something that would be blocking them from producing enough energy. And that kind of keeps their metabolism low. Whereas if you have someone who's on low carb and the only thing preventing them from really getting that energy up is not having enough fuel in the case of carbohydrates, that could cause more stress in a faster period of time, potentially. So saying which is better and which is worse is a tough call, but I would definitely say that we want to make sure that we're getting those other things right. But I do think that carbs are kind of a requirement, at least some amount to fuel the nervous system, because I don't see any other way that we can get to that high energy state without them. Because when we produce the carbs ourselves, like if we don't eat them, our body needs them so badly that they'll convert protein to carbs in order to produce, in order to use carbohydrates. But that requires all this stress to go on.
Yeah.
And ends up depressing the metabolism.
Sure.
Further.
That's often something you'll hear is that statement can be flipped either way depending on which camp you're in. They'll say, you don't need carbs because you'll just make your own, ignoring the fact that, it's quite a stressful process. And so I think one really important concept that you mentioned in part 2 of the series was this idea that essentially you're drawing from this one pool of energy. So all stress is sort of cumulative, and we can't really separate from one to the other. Could you expand on that, basically how we cope with stress?
Yeah, and so as far as hormesis goes, there's this idea that there's the right amount of stress, and anything less or anything more is problematic. But one thing that's often not considered is the fact that all of this is cumulative, and so we have this energy that we produce, and that's what's used to deal with any stress or anything that's requiring the usage of energy. So whether we're just thinking and having a conversation, or whether we're walking outside or running or digesting our food, all of those things require energy. And so they're all drawing from that same energy supply, that same pool.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest flaws in the hormetic model, is that in almost all of the applications, it's the fact that it's cumulative isn't really considered. So, if you take the idea that someone who is not doing too hot, like maybe, they're obese or really overweight, or they have diabetes or whatever it is, the idea that we would want to increase their stress with something like ketosis, and that's going to be beneficial because of hormesis, typically isn't accounting for the fact that this person is already under a considerable amount of stress, like physiological stress, even if they're not psychologically stressed.
Yeah.
And that's evident by the fact that they're not producing energy very well, and so they're in this obese state that leads to dysregulation of hunger and things like that. So all of that is evidence that they're already excessively stressed, and so the idea that we want to add stress onto that kind of ignores the fact that the stress is cumulative, and we're not, if they weren't benefiting from the amount of stress they were currently under, they're not going to benefit from more.
So, a typical approach with someone who is obese, for example, would be caloric restriction, and the supposed benefit of that would be a hormetic mechanism. Is that what the average personal trainer or doctor is claiming?
I would say that's what the researchers are claiming.
Okay.
I think there's probably a disconnect there. I mean, I do think that the average doctor or personal trainer isn't really aware of what hormesis is. And that's because it's a relatively complex topic, but it does seep into all these other areas. But yeah, so that's essentially the idea, is that stress of caloric restriction is going to benefit this person on the deeper level. But the mistake there is that somebody who is obese isn't dealing with a lack of stress. They have an excessive amount of stress, and that's because they have a lack of energy. Yeah. And there's this assumption that if you're obese, it's because you have all this extra energy, so you just keep storing it.
Yeah.
But what's actually happening is that we're storing that energy, or storing that fuel, because we can't convert it to energy. That process is blocked. And so that means that we have an even smaller pool to draw from, and an even smaller energy supply. So we're getting more and more stressed out from everyday things. And then to add any sort of stress on top of that is just icing on the cake. Yeah. I mean, it makes it that much worse.
Sure.
So I would say the answer is kind of the opposite, where we really want to be reducing stress in that scenario, or really in any scenario.
Okay. And there's actually, you've got great, you kind of go down a rabbit hole with your articles. It's like, read this and read that, and you're kind of expanding on many things. And one of them that we should probably cover is the rate of living theory, because this is one I certainly hear a lot about, and I imagine it's partly why some people would recommend that your metabolism be slowed down. Could you maybe give us a bit of a background on what the rate of living theory is and where it came from?
Yeah. So it's a relatively outdated theory, but the kind of older idea is that it's kind of thinking of us as machines, and the faster we run the machine, the faster the machine breaks down and no longer functions. Yeah. And I think that sort of oversimplification in this case is, I mean, it's a pretty flawed one. I mean, it is the problem, but so that was kind of the idea. And then some of the support for this ended up being things like caloric restriction. We're showing that caloric restriction improved lifespan, and we know that caloric restriction reduces the metabolism, so that means that reduced metabolism equals longer lifespan.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's a bunch of issues with that caloric restriction research because, there's a few main ones. So one is that in these studies, normally what they're doing is they're looking at rats who are eating as much as they want versus rats that are calorically restricted. And so the control is eating as much as you want, as opposed to some sort of like regular controlled diet.
Yeah. And
so normally what happens is the ones who can eat as much as they want get really, really overweight. And relative to that, the caloric restriction ones are doing pretty well. Yeah. But that's not really relevant to, like, it's not really a fair control. So that's kind of, and they found actually that the difference in weight gain between that supposed control and the intervention, which is the caloric restriction, accounts for the lifespan extension. So it's not actually a function of the caloric restriction itself. It's just that the other rats are gaining so much weight that's reducing their lifespan.
Yeah.
And then there's a couple other things too, where when they control for certain amino acids, like methionine, for example, just restricting methionine alone is able to cause the same reduction or the same increase in lifespan as caloric restriction as a whole. And there's a few other things like that too. So that's kind of one of the more like one of the common supports for the rate of living theory, and it's really not valid at all. And there's a couple other things too, basically just looking at associations between lifespan and metabolic rate, but they aren't really playing out the way that it was thought. So it is seen where between different species, the ones that have the higher metabolic rate do normally age the fastest, but it's not considering like within a species. So within the same species, it's been shown the opposite, where the individual that has a higher metabolic rate actually lives longer. So the opposite is shown.
Yeah.
And that difference between species has been accounted for by other factors that actually have to do with the type of fats that we have in our cells. And so the more unsaturated the fats, the higher the metabolic rate technically, and the shorter the lifespan. But the reason for the faster metabolic rate is because we're less efficient with our energy in that case. So animals that have more unsaturated fats in their cells, essentially, are less efficient with their energy, so they waste a lot of energy. So that's why you see that difference between species, but not within a species, because within a species, they're typically the same efficiency, and the ones that have more energy live longer, essentially. The ones that use more energy live longer.
Yeah.
So when we take that factor out, there's no relationship there. And in reality, the relationship is showing the opposite.
Yeah. So you would argue that health involves or includes a high rate of metabolism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how is that achieved? Is that achieved by restricting calories or not restricting calories?
Well, that's something that's not fought or not disagreed upon that much. People, it's pretty much acknowledged that caloric restriction, restricting calories reduces the metabolism. Yeah, and that's pretty clear. So,
but you would almost imagine that the opposite is believed to be true with how much caloric restriction seems to be recommended. Maybe this is too much of a tangent. Yeah, it's probably too much of a tangent. So there was one thing you brought up there, which might be a nice segue into something like veganism, but you mentioned the amino acids being restricted, being removed, improving the lifespan. So could that be potentially why veganism may appear to be beneficial on some level? That there is a restriction on harmful amino acids?
Yeah. Well, and that is actually used for, a lot of vegetarians or vegans will use some of those studies as evidence that if you restrict these certain amino acids, which are found in animal foods, they're also found in plant foods too. But, if you restrict, and it's not just methionines, like methionine, cysteine, and tryptophan are the three most prominent ones. And so they are found a lot in animal foods. And so they say, oh, well, those things we know that they're problematic, and so we shouldn't eat animal foods. But one thing that's also included in animal foods, if you're eating the whole animal, is amino acids that balance those out. So like glycine and proline are pretty powerful ones that have an antagonistic relationship with those other amino acids. And these, like the glycine and the proline, these are found in connective tissue, so in bones and meats that are tougher that we would cook like slower, so like roasts and meats like that.
Yeah.
Or like in collagen or gelatin. So people are pretty familiar with those as like protein powders. So those sorts of things, they have amino acids that kind of balance out those other ones. And if you're eating a balanced amino acid profile from that perspective, then you don't have to worry about those effects of the methionine and cysteine and tryptophan. Yeah.
And again, that sort of highlights the point of the importance of nuance, because some people will just say, oh, meat's fine, and they'll just obviously ignore the stuff that points to meat not being ideal. And then the vegans and the vegetarians will say, well, clearly meat's bad and it causes this, but there's a degree of truth perhaps to both sides, and you actually need to kind of look at the data rather than start from a biased point of view. Start from, I love steaks, therefore I'm going to find all the data that allows me to eat steaks, or I love puppies and cows, and I'm going to find the data that makes me feel good about myself for not eating cows. So yeah, I think that might be the point of this whole discussion, is ultimately that once you get down into it and once you really kind of pick things apart, it's much more subtle than one might think. So where would be another element that do you think that the sort of inadvertent restriction of calories through veganism might actually be counterproductive?
Yeah, I mean, I think any caloric restriction is going to be counterproductive for
Yeah,
sure. Um,
but it would appear to be good because some people would think that caloric restriction increases lifespan.
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, so in the research, caloric restriction is like well known as the kind of most consistent intervention at having these
Mm.
sorts of benefits.
Yeah.
And they go beyond lifespan extension too. There's other supposed benefits that again can be accounted for by the changes in amino acids and other things like that. And so another kind of interesting feature of the research is that a lot of lifespan extension research is done on this small worm, microscopic worm called C. elegans, and this research, they do all these things that show an expansion or an extension of their lifespan, but many of them don't account for the fact that this lifespan extension occurs because these little worms, they're kind of going into a hibernation state.
Mm.
And in this hibernation state basically mimics the effects on us too, where they stop using glucose as a fuel. A lot of the metabolic respiration slows down. They aren't properly, they're not properly producing energy at the electron transport chain, all sorts of things like that. And it essentially makes them dysfunctional, like they aren't able to deal with the regular environment. But in the laboratory, they're able to continue living. And so in a study that's looked at as a benefit, it's like, oh, they're able to live longer. And that's what we were looking at is how, if this
Yeah.
intervention will increase lifespan, and it does. But they don't consider that it's because of this very dangerous hibernation state where the animal wouldn't exist and wouldn't be able to continue living if it wasn't in this very specific environment. So that's just kind of another flaw there.
Yeah.
I
So
don't remember exactly how
yeah.
that related back to your question, but
But so that would be sort of like pointing to someone saying, "Look, we've kept him alive for 5 years, but he's been in a vegetative state," or
yeah,
it's
exactly.
focusing too much on the number, the lifespan. I've lived 100 years, but maybe they were terrible years, and so you need to consider that. Yeah. So yeah, the question was sort of going back to veganism, and a lot of people maybe they feel benefits or they think veganism is good because you're getting fewer calories, and fewer calories is associated with increased lifespan. And you were explaining the flaws with the research that are done on microscopic worms. So I suppose we could move on to probably one of the big sacred cows of the moment in nutrition would be intermittent fasting. So how would you debunk or discredit a lot of the claims around intermittent fasting?
Yeah. Yeah, it is definitely a big one. So some of the benefits, I would say one of the most prominent ones that are attributed to intermittent fasting is autophagy. So that's a big one. And we kind of already touched on that and
Yeah.
why the context matters a lot there. But so things like that, like autophagy and mitochondrial biogenesis, those are seen in fasting, and I explained why that's not a good thing. It's because it's a result of this low energy state. There's and I think part of the reason why it's gained a lot of traction too is because people do feel better on it, even though it's not the most comfortable thing to do. So, and I think that a lot of that can be attributed to the effects of intermittent fasting on our guts. I think it's actually a really great example of it, because when we're not eating anything, there's nothing to cause any sort of gut irritation. So if our gut is not functioning very well, which most people's aren't, then when they eat the foods that they typically eat, which encourage these issues anyways, they end up with a lot of different problems. There's different toxins that get produced by the bacteria in the gut when we have different gut imbalances, or we're not digesting our food well and things like that. And so those can be really problematic for a lot of people. They are really problematic. I think it's one of the more common issues. And so when we're doing something like intermittent fasting, it does reduce all of that, like everything related to those gut problems, because you're not eating for a much longer period of the day. And so I would say that that's like the biggest thing that accounts for the benefits of intermittent fasting more than anything else. So when people do feel really good on an intermittent fast, like when they are intermittent fasting, I would say that instead of intermittent fasting, which we know is stressful, because we have to fuel ourselves on, in this kind of starvation state with mostly fats and produce carbs through the release of cortisol and adrenaline and things like that. A much better option would just be to eat a diet that you digest really well, that doesn't cause any of that irritation, doesn't cause that toxin production, and then also restoring gut function in the first place.
Yeah.
I think those are much better routes and cause a lot less stress, and so they're a lot more beneficial in the long run.
Yeah. And so I think you mentioned this in the article, but if someone does feel benefit from intermittent fasting, it suggests that the benefit of getting less gut irritation outweighs the downside of reduced energy. So again, that ties into that nuance. Maybe the gut issues are so bad that it's preferable to go through that. It's preferable to avoid the gut issues than to have enough energy.
Well, those gut issues are kind of what contributes to that low energy. So I think in someone who is benefiting from intermittent fasting, I would say that their their lack of energy is more due to gut irritation or gut toxin production than it is due to the extra stress from the intermittent fasting. So if they are doing it and they have an increased energy demand from that fasting, from that lack of food and all the stress that comes with it, that must be better than what was being caused before by all those gut toxins.
Yeah.
So in both cases, you have low energy. It's just a question of which is causing that low energy, like
Sure.
more than the other. But obviously the better option would just be to do things that increase our energy production, increase our energy supply, and doesn't come with that stress or the gut toxins.
Yeah. And in terms of gut irritation, how individual is that? Does bacteria come into play? Do food sensitivities come into play? Or are there certain ones? Because I know some people will say, I can eat anything, I feel fine. Are there certain gut irritants that everyone is susceptible to?
There is definitely variation there.
Yeah.
And I think, so part of that has to do with where our digestive function's at. So we produce all sorts of different digestive enzymes. We produce bile, we have stomach acid production, and all of those different things allow us to digest our food. And so one person might not be producing enough bile, and that might result in them not being able to digest fats very well. Whereas somebody else, maybe they aren't producing enough lactase, so they aren't digesting milk very well. And so one person might do fine with milk and the other wouldn't, and vice versa with the fats. So that gut function side is definitely individual, and so is what you were mentioning as far as what bacteria are present, whether there's any sort of overgrowth, and whether it's bacteria or fungal or there's all sorts of different kind of gut issues we can have, and so those things are definitely individual. But I would say there's also a pretty decent amount of foods that are going to be universally problematic. So like grains that aren't traditionally prepared. So if they're not soaked and sprouted, if they're not fermented, then they're pretty likely to cause problems for most people. And if somebody doesn't notice it, I think that a lot of times people don't notice that they have any problems with foods because it's just constant and it's all that they know or all that they experience. But then when they take out grains, for example, and then bring them back in, a lot of times they'll notice that difference. Yeah, I think grains are a big one, or beans and legumes are another one. And of course, these are things that are conventionally considered to be pretty healthy. But because of their defensive anti-nutrients, which prevent, these are seeds of the plants and they don't want to be eaten because of that. It's really important for the plant's reproduction in order for them to continue to survive. So they have all sorts of defensive compounds in the seeds that prevent them from being digested well and deter people or animals or whatever wants to eat them from continuing to eat them. So seeds, nuts, grains, legumes, and beans are pretty universally problematic, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. So would it be fair to say that anyone who is getting benefits from intermittent fasting, because I'm sure that people will listen to this and say, well, it works for me, would it be fair to say that it's realistically it will catch up with them? It's not a healthy strategy, but they're getting away with it for now.
Yeah, I think that most people on those sorts of diets, it's similar to, I think, a low carb or ketogenic approach, where people do really well a lot of times for a period of time, and then they there's a crash that typically comes. It happens a lot of times on veganism too, through a different route, but the crash oftentimes comes because we're not getting certain nutrients that we need. And in the case of intermittent fasting, it's less about nutrients because you might be eating the exact same foods, but that stress caused by not eating is still going to be there, and that's still going to take its toll over time. So yeah, I think so for the most part. I can't see any way that based on the physiological response to not eating for that long of a period of time, like I can't see a way where that's not going to lead to deterioration and depressed metabolism and depressed function over time. And as you said earlier, it might happen slower than if they weren't intermittent fasting. So if you're eating the same diet that's not doing too well for your gut, and you eat it during a shorter window versus a longer window, maybe that shorter window is better in the long term. I don't know, but I would say that you don't need to be eating in the shorter window if you change the type of food you're eating.
So maybe you could just have a more enjoyable life where
you
can just eat. Okay. Yeah, the way I always kind of think about it is that, because I did all this stuff, I think you did a lot of this stuff as well, did intermittent fasting, all that low carb, and things caught up with me pretty quickly. Like I was probably no more than a year into some of these things, and they really caught up. And I know people who are doing these things for a few years, but the way I think about it is like health is sort of on this scale, and the higher you are, the closer you are to so-called perfect health, the more leeway you have, and the more you can just kind of chip away at it and not notice. So there's maybe a bit of a blessing in terms of starting with pretty poor health, that the issues with these things become apparent quicker, and you're quicker to realize the error in your ways. So again, that kind of highlights the point that it's all coming from this one pool of energy, and your individual circumstances are going to play into it. So you might have a lot of resilience, you might have good energy stores, you might have everything else in your life tuned in really well, but because you're restricting carbs, you're going to have energy issues. Because you're fasting, you're going to have stress issues. And this is I'm rambling a bit now, but you look at someone like Joe Rogan, and he influences so many people, and I think a lot of people look to him for health advice, and I feel like he's getting away with it because he's getting away with it, because maybe he has more resources, and because maybe he has a job he loves, and maybe he has no financial worries. And you need to consider these things,
and some exogenous testosterone too.
Yeah. I don't know if
I don't think he's quiet about that. I think pretty open. I don't know if he's still doing it. I have no idea. I don't follow his health side that quickly or that closely, but I know he at least was, and he's a pretty big proponent of it. And
point being, it's the problem with looking to someone you don't know, or you don't understand their circumstances, or you don't even consider the relevance of their circumstances, and saying, well, he eats elk meat and he hunts and he fasts, therefore I should too. I had a couple of questions I mentioned to you before we started the call, specifically to do with neurodegenerative diseases, and I was hoping you could lend your expertise. So you did mention one thing in your article, and it was the apparent anti-seizure benefits of ketogenic diets appear to be gut related. So some people would argue that you're providing the brain with ketones, you're restricting addictive, terrible for you sugar, and suddenly the brain is regenerating and people are becoming healthy. What is the flaw with that thinking?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because then I remembered a bunch of other things that people say about, from the low carb side, saying that sugar's addictive and causes leptin resistance and all that. So maybe we'll touch on that. So there was a really interesting study showing that basically showing that the benefits of the ketogenic diet on seizures was entirely based on the effects on the gut. And I think it was a fecal transplant. So they did a transplant from rats that were on the ketogenic diet to rats that weren't on a ketogenic diet, and they had the same benefits, just from basically transferring the gut microbiome from one to the other. So, which does very much fly in the face of the idea that it's the ketones that are providing all those benefits and things like that. Not to say that I think that ketones can't be acutely beneficial. I mean, if
Yeah.
someone's not metabolizing glucose well, then having ketones is better than not having ketones. But that still doesn't make it ideal overall. I would say that restoring the ability to use the carbohydrates is a much better route.
Yeah. So it appears to be, yeah, again, it's just this kind of misunderstood, misguided thing of everyone's focused on the sugar, and we've just kind of accepted that apparently sugar is bad, and you can never question that. And so in this case, we've cut the sugar out. Therefore, this is why we're getting this benefit versus, again, looking a bit deeper and understanding. Because again, there's this other kind of sacred cow with gut health, where we're supposed to think, well, fermentation and feeding bacteria is always going to be a good thing. So yeah, it's a tough one to navigate. So the specific question I had, sort of following from what you mentioned in your article, and then we can maybe get on to the other things that you thought of with regards to sugar, was how would you explain, this is probably the exact same answer, but how might you explain why ketogenic diets appear to be effective for slowing down Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases?
Yeah, so I think it would be for those same two reasons. The one that was, I said more clearly, which was that ketogenic diets reduce gut irritation. They reduce that gut toxin production because most things that people are eating that are feeding their bacteria are carbohydrates. And most people don't have a properly balanced microbiome. So when they end up feeding it, it results in a lot of different toxin production and things like that. And that inhibits energy production and inhibits our ability to use carbohydrates. And that's what causes the whole diabetic state in the first place, which, in regards to Alzheimer's, they talk about it as type 3 diabetes, where it's an inability for the brain to use glucose properly, and endotoxin and ammonia and metabolic toxins like that are produced from the gut can be entirely responsible for that, and they directly inhibit that process. So I think it can very clear, it is very clear that the gut irritation is a huge component there. And then I do think, kind of as I mentioned earlier, is that if you can't metabolize carbs well, then having ketones as an alternative fuel source is going to benefit you. It's better than having a bunch of carbs that you can't use. But it's not going to fix the problem, that's for sure. Okay. And if you're relying on your own body to produce the ketones, then it's also going to require a lot of stress, because we don't produce those ketones unless we're in that stress state of low insulin and high stress hormones. Which is that same diabetic state, which is why we produce ketones in that state and everything like that. But yeah, if you're taking them exogenously, you don't have that same stress going on in order to produce them, and in that case, it's just an alternate fuel. So that I don't think is as problematic, but it's still avoiding the problem. It's not addressing what's really going on.
Yeah, so sugar is not the issue, it's your inability to use sugar, or carbs aren't the issue, your inability to. I often think of people like if someone had knee pain and they're like, squats are bad. Well, no, you have a problem with your knee and it hurts to squat, but squats aren't inherently bad.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So do you want to kind of share the thoughts that came up with regards to sugar and leptin and so on?
Yeah. So that it was definitely something that was pretty prominent on the low carb side, is all this trashing of sugar and carbohydrates. And one of the things there was this idea that it dysregulates our hunger systems. So it causes us to overeat, and we don't actually become full when we eat it, because we're causing this leptin resistance. And the idea is basically that this leptin resistance is similar to insulin resistance, but leptin is just a hormone that controls, or has a role in, or it's a factor that affects, I should say, our hunger. And so the idea was that sugar causes problems there too. But when we actually look at what affects hunger, again, it ends up on the energetic side. So if we have enough ATP in the certain areas, or have enough energy in the certain areas that are responsible for our hunger signals, then we don't get hungry. In other words, our hunger is determined by the amount of energy in certain areas of our brain and in our liver to an extent. So when we have enough energy in those places, which requires us producing energy very well, then our hunger signals turn off, which is a perfect system. When we're not producing energy well, maybe that's because we don't have enough carbohydrates and we're running on fat, or if it's because we aren't able to use the carbohydrates well that we are eating, then we continue to be hungry even if we do eat. And that's where kind of this leptin resistance comes in, where the leptin doesn't, the cells don't respond properly to leptin if they don't have enough energy. So energy is, again, that main mediator there, where the leptin resistance, much like the insulin resistance, occurs because the cells aren't producing energy properly. And so it's it's a long way of saying sugar doesn't cause that issue, at least not on its own. You know?
Yeah. Are you sure? Are you sure? It looks like cocaine. It must be bad. Okay. So was that everything that kind of came up for you there that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, and I mean, just as a disclaimer, I think that it's important to consider the different forms of sugar. We talked about grains earlier, which is very different from the sugar itself. Isn't necessarily all that different from other foods. And some it's different from some, but so the sugar in fruit might be the same as the sugar in table sugar, but that doesn't mean that the effects are all the same, because there's other aspects of fruit that make a difference. So there's kind of a little disclaimer there.
Yeah. So as we begin to wrap up, what would be, so we've laid waste to all of these, or tried to lay waste to all of these sacred cows of nutrition. What would be a practical and better option? Now that you've shattered everyone's dreams, what might be a healthier way to approach nutrition in a nutshell?
Well, I mean, it might be shattering one dream, but we can replace it with another one that includes eating carbs, which I think is a better dream, because at least for me, I never enjoyed not eating them. So, so I do think that having a diet that has enough protein, that includes animal sources, but has those balanced amino acids we talked a little bit about, one that has enough fats, but again, we talked a little bit about the issues with the unsaturated fats, specifically the polyunsaturated fats, which are in the nuts and seeds and their oils, and in fatty fish, and in fatty chicken too, if it's not pastured, and pork as well. So sticking more towards the saturated fats there, again, from the energetic perspective, makes a huge difference. And we actually touched on a little bit of why that is, and it has to do with basically the fact that when the unsaturated fats are used in the cells, it inhibits our ability to produce energy well. We just end up wasting a lot of it.
And just as a quick kind of aside from that, the way I tend to think about it, maybe this is oversimplified, but thinking about the fats and their stability based on temperature, because some people will hear this and think, well, saturated fat, why? I should be having fish oil. So as a quick kind of way of thinking about this, is it fair to say that it's because of their instability at high heats and the body temperature being roughly 37 degrees Celsius? I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit. Something crazy in Fahrenheit.
About 98.
You need Celsius over there anyway. But is it fair to say that it is that instability at high temperatures and it reacting inside the body's temperature that is part of the issue?
Yeah, it's a huge part of the issue. Is that those unstable fats, which are liquids at room temperature, or at least more typically are liquid, those ones are going to become damaged, and that ends up damaging all sorts of, it basically ends up damaging our body in the same way that if you heated it on a pan, it would damage the fats. And so that's a huge part of it, is the saturated fats are more stable. And then the other component of it too is that when we use them as a structural component, the saturated fats are just much better at holding energy and allowing us to produce energy, whereas the unsaturated ones basically cause us to waste that energy. It's not as efficient, and that's where that difference in metabolic rate comes from, as far as the relative saturation of the fats in the cells that we talked about earlier with the rate of living theory.
Yeah. Okay.
I would say those are the two main things there.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have a third thing? Top three, Jay's top three? No.
Well, then, we could do that. I mean, it's easy to separate the macronutrients. We got three of them. We've got protein and fats down. So on the carb side, getting enough carbs is huge. I would say favoring fruit sources is the best option. So whether that's fruit juice or whole fruits, I'd say those are the best.
Yeah. And
honey would probably fall somewhere near there too, and occasional table sugar depending on the context again. But then some of the carbs that I would stay away from would be the grains, legumes, beans, because of their anti-nutrients and their lack of other benefits, lack of other nutrients. So I would say that that's kind of the basics.
Yeah. Okay. So there's hope. There's light at the end of the tunnel. We can have sugar and not feel bad.
Right.
So someone listening to this, they're thinking, okay, I've got a new way of looking at the world. How can I learn more about your work, Jay? How can I maybe work with you, Jay? I got to work with you.
So I can be reached on my, through my email or website. Website's probably easiest. If you go to services on there, you can schedule a free call or check out. I have an online course that's meant to kind of take you through the details of the diet side step by step. And so that all that information's on there. My website's jfeldmanwellness.com, and on Facebook and Instagram, jfeldmanwellness. And I think that was everything.
So, yeah, perfect. I'll include all the links in the show notes. I will include also the articles, parts 1 and 2, because there's some great reading in those. They're detailed, but really worth it. And all the little rabbit holes off from there are really, really beneficial. So anything else you'd like to add as we wrap up?
No, I think that was it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jay. That's been really, really beneficial. I hope people get a lot out of this. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, PA.
You're very welcome. So that was our chat with Jay Feldman. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was thought-provoking. I hope it maybe challenged your beliefs on nutrition, on various interventions. I will say that I kind of struggled at the start. I'd been reading the articles for a while and sort of preparing, and I had notes to kind of direct the flow of the conversation, but I drew a bit of a blank. So I feel like the start, like the main sort of maybe 15-20 minutes of the podcast were a bit clunky on my part, and I could have done better. So hopefully you found that towards the second half things picked up and we got a better flow going with regards to information, and it all made a bit more sense. As I mentioned in the discussion, if you want the really in-depth information, if you want to chase down the research, if you want to check the information that Jay is sharing, I've linked his 2 original articles, Hormesis Part 1 and 2, in the show notes, and that's going to give you all the research and also a few important rabbit holes that sort of tie into this and will help explain in more detail why avoiding carbohydrates might not be the best idea and why we want to keep metabolism high to improve health. So I hope you found the chat beneficial. If you're interested in the work that Jay is doing, you can sign up on his site. He's got a free kind of mini course to help deepen your understanding of these things. I've got links to that. And if you would like to work with him, he works internationally online, and I can't recommend him enough. So check out those links. If you enjoyed his appearance, if you enjoyed even his past appearances, if you've been happy to have him or to hear him on this podcast, please let him know. I think that'll go a long way to kind of let him know that his time has been well spent and that people are benefiting from him putting in the time to do this. So thanks for listening. If you have any questions, as usual, let me know. If you want to work with Jay, all the links are there. That's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Have a great day. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Physical Education Podcast. If you're the kind of person who likes to help others, then share this with someone in need. If you found value in the information here, they will too. So please share this in whatever way you can. If you have any questions, you can email me directly at pa@thebackpaincoach.net. I may even use your question for a future podcast episode. If you'd like more information to help you overcome pain, be sure to follow The Back Pain Coach on Instagram, Facebook and YouTube, and to join my newsletter. The major turning points in my own recovery have come from changes in perception and through learning more about myself. I believe that we can help others by sharing information that expands their minds. Finally, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher so that others may find this information and you can play a positive role in their healing journey. Thanks again for listening.